Hello, listeners, and welcome to the NKNews Podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and today it is the 14th of June, 2022, and I'm joined from the east of the United States via Zoom by journalist and author Katie Stallard to talk about her new book, Dancing on Bones, History and Power in China, Russia, and North Korea. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you all, please, to leave a review about this podcast wherever you can. Spotify allows ratings but not reviews. Apple Podcasts allows both. And on YouTube, you can like and subscribe us. And please also, if you find this an interesting episode, share it with everyone you know and 3 people you don't. Secondly, check us out on nknews.org and consider buying a subscription. That helps to fund the excellent journalism put out by my colleagues every day. And thirdly, you can follow NKNews.org, all one word, on Twitter, and myself at JackoZ. For podcast suggestions and feedback, you can tweet at us or email at podcast@nknews.org. Okay, so to introduce my guest today more properly, Katie Stallard, previously based in Russia and China as a foreign correspondent for Sky News. Now she's senior editor for China and Global Affairs at the New Statesman and author of Dancing on Bones, History and Power in China, Russia and North Korea, which will be published in the United States, or I should say was published in the United States on May 2nd. And in the United Kingdom will be published on August 1st. You can follow her on Twitter at Katie Stallard, all one word. Welcome on the show, Katie.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm a longtime fan of the podcast.
Thanks, that's great. You are one of 5 people. I kid.
It's an elite and a highly well-selected group.
Yes, it's like the Central Committee or the Party Centre.
Exactly.
I want to start by reading the first sentence of your book abstract, which you were kind enough to send to me. Dancing on Bones examines how the leaders of Russia, China, and North Korea exploit the history of past wars, specifically World War II and the Korean War, to shore up popular support and frame contemporary challenges and foreign policy. Given what's going on in Ukraine, it's obviously a timely book, and so I want to ask, when did you start writing it?
Well, I started writing it, I guess, early 2018, but the idea really came out of the start of the war in Ukraine. So when I was based in Russia, but covering Ukraine and traveling backwards and forwards a lot to Ukraine, Crimea, and then what became the conflict in eastern Ukraine in 2014. And it really struck me there very early on how prevalent the Second World War history was. So what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, right from the first days of that conflict, people were referencing that war and framing the current fighting in terms of that history. So that was what really sparked my interest in understanding what is the version of history that you would learn if you grew up here, and how is that shaping how you see these current events.
And we've seen that earlier this year with the launch of Russia's War on Ukraine version 2.0, with the constant references to denazification, which to anybody outside Russia make no sense in Ukraine, but in that discourse that's being used, it completely fits in.
Yeah, I mean, people who watch Russian state media have been being told really in earnest for 8 years, since 2014, that Nazis and fascists have taken control of the Ukrainian government and that they're carrying out terrible atrocities against civilians in the East. But that really plays into this broader history, which has become so prevalent and so important under Vladimir Putin. He has really elevated the history of the Great Patriotic War more broadly and really used that to try and rally popular support behind his rule. So he's made the war this sort of, front and center, very, very prominent part of Russian contemporary identity. And then he's drawing on that and with this idea that now, once again, as before in this, great heroic conflict, Russia is called upon to do battle against the forces of fascism and Nazis, which obviously is plainly, ridiculous, has no basis in reality. But if you're steeped in that media system and that information environment, I had plenty of conversations with people who truly, genuinely believed that is what was happening in Ukraine. There was a famous story, I think it was 2015 that this was being reported, that Ukrainian government forces had supposedly crucified crucified a child. They were said to have captured this 3-year-old boy and crucified him in a public square in eastern Ukraine as a lesson to others who were sympathizing with the Ukrainian government forces, which was not true, but it was aired on Channel 1. There was a woman who claimed to have witnessed it, who described heart-rending details of this little boy's screams as he was tortured in this public square. So that was the version of reality that viewers of Russia's most watched television network were getting about that war. And it was effective. I mean, obviously not everybody believed it, but for people who were tuning into that world, that's what they thought was going into Ukraine. And that's the backdrop to what's happening now. And this, the narrative that once again, Russians are the good guys, and their soldiers are doing battle with these forces of evil in Ukraine right across the Russian border.
What does the title of your book mean, Dancing on Bones? Is it a quote or a reference?
Yeah, this is a quote from a Russian activist who started his own memorial movement in Russia to try and remember. He felt like the way the war was being commemorated had become very bombastic, very militaristic. And he and a couple of friends started this movement that they called the Immortal Regiment, where they would just, march quietly holding pictures of relatives who had died in the war on the anniversary.
The war you're talking about here is the Second World War?
Is the Second World War. So
right.
Yeah, they would hold photographs of relatives who died fighting in the war and just march sort of quietly and solemnly on the anniversary, instead of these, the great bombastic parades that you see through Red Square. But that movement became very popular. Hundreds of thousands and then millions of people wanted to take part in it across Russia. So the authorities co-opted it, worked it into the overall memorial celebrations, and made it part of the official commemoration. So Vladimir Putin today walks at the front of this new sort of state-sponsored version of the Immortal Regiment. And he and his friends really felt this had been taken over. It had been turned into something it was never meant to be. And his quote was that the authorities were dancing on bones. They were taking the memory of their ancestors and everyone who had fought and died in this world and in this war, and using them for quite cynical political purposes.
Now, in the book, you look at North Korea, Russia, and China, but this podcast focuses mainly on North Korea. So I want to get all my North Korea questions out of the way first, and then come back to the overall big picture of the three countries. So I understand that you've been on at least one reporting trip to North Korea. So tell us when that was and what the occasion was.
That was 2016 for the Workers' Party Congress with Kim Jong-un. And I want to be clear, and I want to, I make the point in the book that, I think there can be a lot of what James Pearson at Reuters called, rare glimpse reporting of North Korea, where we go in on what are effectively junkets, do our best to not show other journalists in the back of our shots, and make out like we're getting some amazing exclusive access. I want to be clear, it was as part of a very organized press trip, a very choreographed, really, I think a junket is the right word to describe going in. But that said, it's still, it was I think valuable to be able to go there and see some of this with my own eyes and talk to some people for myself.
Now, the American novelist William Faulkner wrote this famous sentence, or actually it's two sentences: "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And I'm very much reminded of that when thinking about North Korea and history and how it uses history to frame its present disputes and disagreements. And in North Korea, it sometimes feels like everything that happened in Korea and to Korea since Kim Il-sung's birth back in 1912, and even some events before that, are still very, very current.
Yeah, I was really struck. I reported a lot on North Korea from Beijing, so I had watched a lot of the propaganda, read a lot of the speeches, and then going there myself, I was really struck as so many of your listeners will know how prevalent that history is. Literally in the center of Pyongyang, the Arch of Triumph, this great monument carved with the date 1945 to commemorate these events. That there is truth at the core of these stories, but a lot of what has been built around them is largely fictional, or at least very greatly exaggerated. So, standing there looking at the Arch of Triumph, which one of the minders pointed out is bigger than the one it's an exact replica of the one in Paris, he said, but this one is bigger.
Yeah.
and asking him about the history, this commemorates, and being told that this is, it's engraved with the date 1945 because that's the date Kim Il-sung and the Korean partisans liberated the Korean peninsula from Japanese rule, which of course is not what happened, but has been literally etched in stone in the center of the capital.
But why is it so important to North Korea to believe that Kim Il-sung himself and his partisans single-handedly defeated the Japanese rather than the armies of the Soviet Union and the other allied nations?
One of the things that I thought was interesting in the course of researching the book is how much that story has changed, and that at the start, the story was the other way around. And actually, one of your colleagues, Fyodor Tertitsky, has done some great research on this, that in the very early days of North Korea, in fact, Kim Il-sung paid great credit to the Soviet army and to Stalin, and did not try to take credit for liberating the peninsula. But over time, that story has come, at the start, it's the Soviets, and then, a decade later, it's the Soviets with the Koreans supporting them. And a decade later than that, the Koreans are in the lead. And now, as you would be told that story, it's pretty much single-handedly Kim Il-sung and the Korean People's Revolutionary Army, an organization that we have no evidence actually existed, depicted, in great detail on this triumphant charge back into the Korean peninsula, liberating the place erupting with cheers and triumphant celebrations for Kim Il-sung. So it has become this great story over many decades, but I think it's so important because it goes to the heart of the story that the Kim regime tells the population as to why they must be in power, is because they descend from this great leader who twice, according to the official version of history, has supposedly defeated these great empires, first Japan and then the United States in the Korean War as it's presented, and defended North Korea. So that's, it's sort of the ultimate claim to legitimacy, and to why the Kims, with their, revolutionary sacred Paektu blood, must be in power, because they're, going right back to the founder. They are the ones who are, or at least their people are told, who have defended the country and repelled these great foreign threats.
So basically, it helps to build up Kim Il-sung and his family's legitimacy to believe that he was the leader of the liberation.
Yes, yeah, it gives him and it gives the present day regime this heroic backstory and this really extraordinary claim to power. If you were to take at face value everything that he's said to have done, he's an extraordinary, semi-mythical leader. So that is tremendously valuable to both his son and now to his grandson, Kim Jong-un.
Now, I'm guessing here that Brian Myers might argue that since Kim Il-sung spent most of the Second World War in the Soviet Union not fighting against the Japanese, specifically because the Soviet Union and the Japanese had a non-aggression pact or treaty or agreement. Anyway, the Soviet Union wasn't at war with Japan until the last 2 weeks of the Second World War. And so basically Kim and his partisans who had sought shelter in the Soviet Union were told, basically cool your heels, do some training, but do not go out and fight the Japanese. And so they weren't allowed to fight the Japanese. And at this 3 to 4 year period of non-activity, if it were known in North Korea, would be, quite deleterious to the reputation of Kim Il-sung as a great battle leader. And that it may be in a way a kind of overcompensation, saying, well, not only was he fighting, but he led the liberation of North Korea, of the whole Korean peninsula, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, it actually, the story doesn't even make sense. I asked Tae Young-ho about this a couple of years back when he was visiting DC. How can this story possibly be logical if you do take it at face value and you believe everything that you're told, that Kim has raised this tremendous army, he's liberated the entire peninsula, but then the next day the peninsula is divided with no further wars being fought. So even if you take it exactly as it's supposed to happen, it does not make sense. And he said, but that's not what people are taught. It's not about people, being encouraged to reason and examine and really scrutinize the history. It's about, learning this is the right version of events and being able to replicate that. So the story does not make sense. And you're right to point out, when you see now Kim Jong-un on his horse retracing supposedly his father's mythical battle sites on Mount Paektu, that's not where Kim Il-sung was fighting. He was in Manchuria in northeast China. And then, as you rightly point out, once the Japanese had really taken control of northeast China, he was forced across the border into the Soviet Union. And then he was there until after the end of the war. He didn't return to the Korean Peninsula until September. So, he wasn't even physically on the ground, let alone fighting these great battles. And when you go back and look at some of the early records, he goes to a Soviet officer at one point quite early on and asks him to write the Koreans back into the liberation story. And the Soviet officer records that he said no. The Soviets were concerned, while they wanted to build up the idea that he was this guerrilla war hero, because that helped lend him legitimacy, and they needed someone who could be a credible figurehead in North Korea, because the South had Syngman Rhee. So they were invested to a point in building him up, but they were concerned that if they went too far and they gave him too much credit, that he might get out of control. He would demand much more. So the Soviets were also wary about the story that he came to tell. And it's, when you look back through the archival records, by the 1950s, once the story has really started to take off and Kim Il-sung has started to take more of the credit, senior Soviet figures, Leonid Brezhnev is one of those who goes to Pyongyang for Congress in 1956 and comes back complaining about how much credit Kim is now taking for that war and how out of control his personality cult is getting. So even those who are nominally supportive of the regime were concerned about the extent to which he was falsifying this history and really trying to take so much of the credit for himself.
Let's talk a bit about the start of the Korean War. It's basically agreed upon by historians that while there were skirmishes and battles of various sizes all along the inter-Korean border that was the 38th parallel in 1948, 49, and 1950, that it was North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, who launched an all-out war along the parallel only after obtaining the support from Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. Nevertheless, North Korea still maintains the line that South Korea started the war at the instigation of the United States, represented in the form of the then Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Regardless of its accuracy, what's the usefulness of this narrative?
The usefulness is still being used today to argue for why the North needs to build up its military strength, why it needs to develop its weapons programs, in the current iteration, why it needs to spend so much money and channel so many of its scarce resources into the nuclear program, because it's this story that North Korea has been attacked. The Kim regime's version of history has North Korea as a peaceful republic, simply trying to live as a socialist, a happy socialist paradise, and to keep its people safe and build towards a prosperous future. But it keeps being attacked by these hostile foreign imperialists. So the idea that North Korea has been attacked unprovoked and then suffered dreadfully, again, puts the Kim regime in the position as heroes, defenders, because it's Kim Il-sung who once again is said to have led this heroic, extraordinary resistance. And in North Korea's version of that story, to have defeated the United States. The way that they present it is that they were attacked unprovoked, this terrible surprise offensive. But Kim Il-sung was able to draw on his skills from his previous guerrilla combat against the Japanese to retreat, to draw the imperialists further north up the Korean peninsula, and then mount this extraordinary counterattack, force them back across the 38th parallel and bring them to their knees, and force them to sign the armistice agreement, or it's really kind of presented as a de facto surrender in the north. If you believe that, and if that's the only version of history you have access to, then Kim Il-sung twice in a decade has defeated first Japan, then the United States, driven these mighty empires out of North Korea, defended his people. And that's, his son and his grandson claim that they are following in his footsteps, that they similarly are defending the country from these terrible foreign threats, which have never gone away and which could be plotting to attack the country once again. I got the chance to go to the DMZ on both sides, but when you go from the North Korean side, you're told, this is the most dangerous place on earth, and you're really given the impression that you're told, and in fact you're told this on both sides, that our soldiers will keep you safe from now on, because this is such a dangerous place, and things could erupt at any moment. So that story is terribly powerful, and if you don't have access to any alternative sources, it could be quite compelling. But again, it goes to the heart of why the Kim regime says it must be in power, that it must build up the country's military strength, and now that it must develop these weapons programs.
Now, North Korea, in its education and in its children's comic books, which have long been an area of fascination for me, is always reliving the Japanese colonial period and the Korean War, forever talking about the bad things that the Americans and the Japanese did. And it promotes the idea that Koreans will be avenged. And there are posters that I've seen pledging 100,000 times revenge on behalf of the North Korean people for what the Americans have done. And in fact, the emotion that I see most often from North Korean propaganda is not so much a fear or a sadness about US attacks or Japanese colonialism and a desire to live in peace with her neighbors going forward, but rather anger, regret at not having been a stronger nation back then, and a desire for revenge. Did you find that too? And does such an emotional slant use historical narratives in a certain way?
It certainly does. What I would say, just as a caveat to that, is that I found there was a disconnect, and from other people I've talked to too, that there was a little bit of a disconnect between the sort of the abstract idea of Americans and thrice-fold revenge against the terrible American imperialists, and then relating to individual Americans. There did seem to be somewhat of a, that didn't necessarily translate into personal enmity. In fact, the opposite. I'm British, but American friends who've traveled there more often say they've really never experienced, any feeling of sort of personal enmity from belonging to the United States. But it certainly does really go to the heart of what people are told about why the country must be strong. And I think it's one of the elements that makes me quite pessimistic about, we saw, and I know, some people are terribly optimistic that Kim Jong-un was on the verge of, striking a great bargain with Donald Trump a couple of years back. One of the things that gives me pause about the prospects for that is the extent to which the regime does rely on this story, and that it would be very difficult to keep that going if you did have much more exchange of information and people with the outside world. It would be hard to keep that story as central as it is now. And it is, and Andrei Abrahamian writes about this in his book, that even during those summits, so while that was going on and while people were reporting that some of the anti-American propaganda had been taken down in Pyongyang and some of the areas where visitors were more likely to see it, that still, the Sinchon Museum of American Atrocities, which is this extraordinary exhibition of these terrible tortures and murders that American soldiers are supposed to have carried out against Koreans during the Korean War, for which there's no evidence that is the case. But this museum, which preserves that version of history, was still functioning as normal. He describes watching the coaches pull up outside, the workers' parties, tour the exhibits and then be taken outside to the revenge pledging place to vow their revenge. So even as Kim Jong-un was pursuing diplomacy, the regime was still doubling down on that version of history that it was teaching at home. And it's one of the things that I have asked to South Korean diplomats. Would it be, one element of showing good faith would be to, for instance, shutter the Sinchon Museum of Atrocities, or to change somewhat, just to lessen the fervor with which people are taught about that history, would be part of, it would be a way, without threatening the physical security of the country, to show that North Korea is serious about engagement internationally. And they have all scoffed and laughed and said, no, that is not a credible area for negotiation, because that's a central part of the North Korean regime story, and they will not, that will be the last thing that they give up, is that version of history. The
Sinchon massacre, as you said, took place allegedly between the 17th of October and the 7th of December in 1950 in South Hwanghae province. And I read the excellent English translation of Hwang Seok-yong. He's a South Korean novelist. His novel, The Guest, which is all about not just the massacre, but precisely about remembering it and memorializing it decades later. And he wrote that novel after having traveled to North Korea and having met Korean Americans who had been at Sinchon. And basically he leans towards it having been a Korean on Korean massacre from both sides, that the North Koreans conveniently blame on Americans because it's much easier to externalize the enemy than to look at an enemy within one's own race.
Yes, the evidence that has been uncovered, and the historian Adam Cathcart has also written very well on this, that the evidence that has been uncovered does suggest that this was inter-Korean violence, but that doesn't fit the story of the Koreans being sort of pure, vulnerable, and being themselves victimized by this outside power, which is the Americans. So it is much more politically expedient to blame this on the United States.
Now, let's talk about nuclear weapons. North Korea uses some aspects of its history to justify its development and manufacture and possible future use of nuclear weapons. One aspect of history that it doesn't talk about much anymore is how fervently anti-nuclear it was until around 1990. And you can still find on the internet and in old books, you can find photographs of people, foreigners, who are invited specifically to Pyongyang and encouraged to march through the streets with nuclear disarmament slogans on it, even while North Korea was probably already secretly working to develop its own nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I mean, so the story changes as and when it needs to. It just, as you say that, I'm reminded of similarly, North Korea was fervently against hereditary succession until it was decided that Kim Jong-il would be the successor to Kim Il-sung, and then that entry was taken out of the dictionary. These positions, I guess that one area that can be cause for optimism is there have been 180-degree shifts in policy, and it is possible to say the thing that yesterday we said was terrible and was something that only exploitative capitalist societies do. Actually, that's the best possible course for North Korea, and everybody will now begin discussing why hereditary succession is the best possible model for North Korea. So it is possible to effect these abrupt changes, but it's striking how cynically the regime has adapted these ideas for its own purposes over many decades now.
Now, the current chairman of North Korea's Workers' Party, Kim Jong-un, has been in power for 10 years, and he's using those historical narratives to fuel current activities at building missile systems and developing more nuclear weapons, and to continue a hostile stance against what he calls a hostile stance towards North Korea by South Korea, America, Japan, etc. I wonder, could he have chosen a different path when he took power 10 years ago if he had wanted to?
Well, yeah, I mean, one thing that the regime does have is an option of various enemies. And one thing that you can see at times is emphasizing different enemies. So, for instance, North Korea could play down, or at least could stop fanning the flames of anti-Americanism, and still draw on anti-Japanese sentiment, which is something that particularly, in a future where there is more integration with South Korea, there would be that would be a common enemy that they could call upon. So there is, and you see this more explicitly happen in China, is enemies shifting, and for instance, the United States moving from being ally during the Second World War to enemy during the Korean War to then some position again of reflecting on how they were allies during the Second World War post the Nixon visit, and then now back to very much imperialist enemy during the Korean War. So the history is flexible somewhat depending on the politics of the day, but that story is so useful and it's so central to the current leadership in North Korea that it's difficult to see that they would be minded to take the opportunity or to risk rather getting rid of that story, because it has served them so well over 7 decades at this point. So it would be a very brave decision to move away from that.
Now, is North Korea both a threat and being threatened? Are both things possible at the same time, or are they mutually exclusive?
So I think that you can, without being too credulous about the vision that Kim Jong-un paints about the outside world, I think that there is a distinction between why the regime says it needs nuclear weapons and why it genuinely believes it needs nuclear weapons. And speaking to regime officials, and I had the chance, for instance, to interview the ambassador to the UK a few years back, he was surprisingly forthcoming in terms of, obviously he referenced how, he talked about when we weren't strong in the past, when we didn't have nuclear weapons, we became a Japanese colony and we learned for ourselves, the dangers of being weak. But when we look around us at the world now and we see what happens in Afghanistan, we see what happens in Iraq, we see what happens in Libya, we see what happens to countries that don't have nuclear weapons. If North Korea did not have nuclear weapons, perhaps there would be very different discussions about the potential for regime change and the type of options that the West might consider. So, without buying wholly into the narrative, there is logic to what they're saying.
Yeah. Now, what are the different cultural and communication tools that the North Korean government uses to get these messages across to its population?
Well, really, this starts very early childhood. I got the chance to visit kindergartens in Pyongyang, as I think most journalists do when they go through. And one of the things that you see, for instance, is just the artwork on the walls. Yeah. From kindergarten, and particularly from I got a chance to go into an elementary school, and there it's so the kindergarten is very much sort of it's militaristic, the squirrel and the hedgehog cartoon creatures driving tanks and rocket launchers. Yep. And there's a sort of martial military theme to a lot of the artwork, but it's not as graphic. Once you get into the school system, then it is friezes on the school corridors depicting the Sinchon massacre, showing really, really bloody, gory scenes, and that's very much through also then the popular entertainment. So cartoons. You mentioned comic books. Yeah. I discussed this with one friend who spent a lot of time in North Korea, and she said it was sort of like, the cartoons are sort of Tom and Jerry, but to the nth degree, and where it's very clear who is the heroic North Korean character standing up to these evil villainous Americans. Yeah. And so it's really from a very early age, and then that's reinforced through the political indoctrination sessions through and right up through then into Kim Jong-un's speeches and the all of the the official events that people are required to study, really reinforces this same the same narrative, how the country was attacked, how it suffered, and why it's now becoming strong and able to defend itself. So it's that idea, and this version of history is really baked in from a very, very early stage. And it's something that some of those who have escaped have commented on, of where they perhaps were disaffected. And, it's obviously a very self-selecting group, people who have escaped, but where they may have been quite disaffected with the regime, even the leader themselves. They often did still comment that they found that history persuasive, and that was one of the hardest things to accept, was that the country had not been attacked unprovoked at the start of the Korean War, that was such a bedrock part of education from a very early age, that it is very difficult to accept that wasn't the case, and that was a lie that they had been told.
Does your research lead you to conclude that sooner or later North Korea would be likely to launch some kind of aggression on South Korea or Japan, or both?
I mean, I think the regime is very interested in self-survival and self-preservation. So I think it's sort of in a position where it can never afford to fully vanquish these enemies, and it can obviously, it can't afford to lose. So I think, assuming that Kim is getting reasonably good intelligence, then I think it's certainly possible that there would be more, provocations on the level that we've seen, and attacks short of what they believe will provoke a serious military response. I think that's absolutely within the realm of possibility. But in terms of, I think we see, increasingly this idea that, does Kim Jong-un plan to try and unify the peninsula by force? Would he stage a large-scale attack on South Korea? And I think, just for someone who has spent so much time, and who seems to be so interested in, he has potentially a very long, he's not even really into full middle age yet. He has potentially another half century in power if he lives as long as his grandfather did. Yeah. I don't think there's a reason to think that he's reckless, and that he would do anything that would seriously jeopardize his own personal survival and the survival of the regime. So it makes sense to try and keep this such that there is a tension on the issue. There are efforts to placate him, to engage him, and to where he thinks that that's valuable. But there is no incentive to go beyond that and provoke an outright conflict, which there's certainly no guarantee that he would win and would not result in terrible losses and further devastation.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit now and look at the broader themes of your book. Isn't it the thing about history in all times and all places that countries pick and choose which bits to remember and how to remember them, or how to carry them forward? Don't all countries do this? Yes, they do. I write this in the introduction. I talk about growing up myself in the UK, and the degree to which the Second World War's history plays into cultural identity there, and the extent to which it is used cynically, for political purposes. We saw that during the Brexit referendum, and I now live in the United States, where there is a live and ongoing debate about which parts of history to remember, and should we look critically at the past? Should we only remember the glorious heroic parts? Researching the book and really thinking through these questions, I came down very firmly on the side that approach to history really only serves those in power and the existing status quo. That doesn't serve individual citizens. It doesn't help to tackle any of the real present problems that the country faces. And so we should really guard against, it is very seductive to hear these, wonderful heroic stories about, ancestors and how they fought during the war. But, I think we should be very wary of people who come bearing those stories, because, they are highly selective. And I think it is really much more in our interest to complicate those narratives as much as possible, and to look at, growing up in the UK, we focused on the D-Day landings, Dunkirk and the heroism on the Western Front.
we did not talk at all about the firebombing of Dresden. We also did not talk very much about, all of the terrible suffering and dying that was happening in China. We focused on a very selective version of history, and that doesn't, that doesn't serve us as citizens of our own country or citizens of the world to be idealistic about it. So, yes, in short, this does happen everywhere, and the temptation to do it, anyone who wants to be in power or who wants to keep power would be well served to appeal to history, as selectively as they can and to make it suit them. But, we as citizens should be very wary of that. And I think where you get to in each of these three countries is where it becomes very difficult to challenge those official narratives. In some cases dangerous, in some cases, perhaps you risk losing your job. In Russia now, you risk going to prison for a very long time. In these countries, it has become very difficult and very dangerous to challenge that narrative. So, there's been a bit of discussion here in the US about whether, I've seen it mentioned in passing, that perhaps we should have our own campaign against historical nihilism. Warning bells should sound, sirens should flash. We absolutely should not seek to emulate this approach.
Well, let's talk a bit about Russia and China. What do they have in common with North Korea, and what sets them apart in their use of history to fuel current grievances, wars, or territorial disputes?
Well, why I approached the three of them together, which, with hindsight was a probably slightly ridiculous scope of a project to undertake, was because I felt that they were the three countries that I, as a reporter, was focusing on all of the time, and that seemed to be in this grouping of countries that were presented in the West as being, these great threats to the international order. And I was struck by the extent to which the stories that you heard on the ground inside these countries and the version of history that they told about themselves was very different to how they were being represented and portrayed in the Western media. So I wanted to sort of take these three countries that I felt we talked a lot about and try and understand a little bit more from the inside out about, how do they approach this period of the past? Because, I think with all three, there is kind of this temptation to believe that, they are strongman authoritarian regimes, that the men, and they are all men, at the top, are almost sort of Bond villainesque, running these countries from these, in Putin's case, enormous tables in the middle of the Kremlin, commanding their minions, pulling a lever, and their will being done. And it struck me that the reality is very, very different, and much more complex, much more nuanced, and in fact, in all three cases, they are going to quite a considerable extent to seed a story as to why they must be in power and to justify their actions to the populace. It's a totally separate question whether people actually believe that or not. Yeah. But there are very real efforts to justify their claim to power, to justify their weapons program, to justify their foreign policy. So I wanted to try and understand that, and try and understand it a little bit more, at ground level from the inside out.
And is there anything that sets North Korea apart from the other two?
I mean, North Korea, there's a lot that sets North Korea apart from the other two. I mean, I have purposely very simplified and very tightly focused. I looked specifically at the use of this wartime history, so World War II and Korean War history across the three countries. You could write another 10 books about stories around ethnicity, ideas of unique Koreanness. Well, I guess Brian Myers has already written a couple of books on that. But, there is a much, for all of these three countries, there is a much bigger, much more complex set of stories around national identity. But I wanted to pick one subject that would be possible to trace across all three. So that was why I wanted to look at the wartime history. I mean, the obvious also, I felt that they were each within various different degrees of, in terms of access to information. When I started the project, Russia was a relatively free media environment, at least online. If you wanted to, you could get on the internet and look up anything you wanted, whereas North Korea was was at fully the other end of that spectrum, right, in terms of access to any information or online. As you know, it's really more of an intranet. Mm-hmm. Yep. So there were gradations across the three countries in terms of the specifics and the sort of tactical details. But what was common to the three was the extent to which they were drawing on this story of the war, and in all cases, at the very least, a highly selective, very distorted version of the war. And in North Korea's case, in parts of that, as we've discussed, actually not even true.
Did you find elements of religious or pseudo-religiosity in these three countries in the service of present-day warmongering?
Oh, absolutely. Especially so, in the Russian case, you really see that happen quite explicitly during Putin's term in power, is the extent to which he has rehabilitated the Orthodox Church, and how important, he has a moment in, I think it's 2021, when he sort of ties these threads together and visits the opening of this cathedral that's dedicated to the armed forces on the outskirts of Moscow, where the entrance steps are made from melted down German weapons, and it's sort of it's almost like a literal temple to the heroism during the Second World War. And he tours it with Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. So I've written about how he stands outside this cathedral with these sort of key elements that he's appealing to, which is God and the history of the war, and the message that Putin is really broadcasting there is that God and history are on my side. So he is really, it really started to come back properly under Yeltsin, but Putin has seized on the Orthodox faith and really associated himself very, very personally with that.
Looking back at the Russia-Ukraine situation now, back to the last 8 years, would you say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was inevitable? I mean, were we on that track from 2014, or could it have gone differently?
For me, I think I should have been less surprised than I was. I will be completely honest that I didn't think he would invade. To me, I think that Putin is a rational actor. I think he's fairly careful. I think he does take risks, but they're calculated risks. And to me, it just looked like, Ukraine is an absolutely vast country. It's I've traveled a lot across it. It's more than 40 million people. For context, Russia is 140 million people. So trying to invade and potentially then occupy a country that is almost a third the size in terms of population, wholly opposed to Russian occupation, just seemed to me that militarily would be so catastrophic that I couldn't believe he would go ahead with it. With hindsight, and as soon as I remember very clearly the morning that the full-scale invasion started, and hearing the language that he'd used when he talked about this demilitarization and denazification campaign, and feeling just sick to my stomach, because I felt like, of course, this is where this was leading. There had been part of me that was always just a little bit cynical as to, how well would this really hold up? It's one thing to really get behind the Second World War history and to really celebrate, the return of Crimea, for which there was really very little. There were sanctions, but there was very little meaningful price to pay for that. I was skeptical about how well that would hold up once there was real damage to the economy, once young Russians were coming back in coffins. And I did not fully expect that Putin would risk that. But with hindsight, of course, this is what he was building towards. And, that old phrase about when someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time, Putin has been telegraphing very clearly how he sees the world, that he doesn't believe Ukraine is a sovereign state. He doesn't believe it's a real country. I think he genuinely does believe that it is being controlled by the West, and therefore, every year that he doesn't take action is another year that Ukraine gets arms and gets training from NATO members. So I think I don't believe that this was a sort of the idea that he's terminally ill and he's acting out as one last final gamble. I think this is quite a clear strategic decision that Ukraine was leaving Russia's orbit. It was only going to get more so once the last sort of pro-Russian oligarch was arrested last year. I think he saw this as the only way to keep Ukraine, or at least to dismember Ukraine to the point where it could never threaten Russia, which is a very long way of saying I was wrong.
Looking across to the China-Taiwan situation now, in light of what's happening in Ukraine, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I do see that as very separate from Ukraine. I think what will be being learned, by both Taipei and Beijing, is the extent to which some of these tactics have and have not worked. And I think on the Taiwan side, really investing heavily now in asymmetric capabilities, in ensuring that this would be a very high cost operation. Why I think it's different is because I think in China's case, it would be driven very much by domestic considerations. I think for Putin, he saw Ukraine as a wrongly, but did see Ukraine as a national security threat. I think China sees Taiwan as a domestic matter, and something that would go to the core. Getting this wrong and making the wrong decision on this from Beijing's perspective would jeopardize so much of what the Communist Party leadership has worked for so long now, in terms of economic growth, in terms of being able to show why they need to be in power from that perspective. That they would put all of that in danger to go after Taiwan, and I think they would really only do it if they felt, maybe a legitimate comparison with Ukraine is if they did feel that it was now, it was now act now or act in 5 years. If they believed that Taiwan was leaving the option of ever, I guess, being returned or coming back as they would see it, if they thought that that the opportunity was now slipping away on a permanent basis, perhaps they would act. Perhaps this is overly optimistic, but I think Xi is cautious, is not keen to blow up, his legacy, particularly, not in the near term, as he's seeking a third term in power. And while the military capabilities, it really is a very, we've seen how the Russian army have struggled in Ukraine, trying to do that at sea against a heavily defended island. This would not be a small undertaking. So, I think we can be optimistic that it's not imminent, but I think we are moving into a very dangerous period where she will be considering his legacy, and where it certainly, it wouldn't be beyond the bounds of possibility.
Last two questions now, Katie. What would you like to include in an updated version of the book if you were to publish it next month?
Well, that's very easy, because it ends with the Russian army massed on the borders of Ukraine in January of this year. So, I would absolutely have an epilogue looking at exactly what has happened and the extent to which Putin has really drawn on this denazification narrative. So he unfortunately, the thesis is playing out in real time, and I would also add that it has proven so far much more effective than I thought it would be. It is holding up, or at least it is very difficult to argue with it publicly. So we're seeing, in real time, we're seeing how dangerous these historical narratives are, and the absolutely devastating consequences that can flow from them.
Now, I'm wondering about the audience of your book. Who do you think will give your central messages the best reception? And is there a danger that you might be preaching to the choir?
Well, I guess I wrote it for anyone who, I guess, in honesty, the answer to this is I was thinking about people like my father, who are very interested in what's happening in the world and aim to keep across world events and follow what's happening, but don't often have the chance to go to these places themselves. or to sort of, immerse themselves in the history. So the idea was really for anybody who, like my father, an audience of one, is just interested in understanding, I think there will be a lot of people who have a depth of knowledge in one of these countries, or perhaps even two of these countries. But it was really to try and take people, on the ground to the extent that I could, and take you through. It starts in 1945, so take you through the last 7 decades and give you a sense of how might you be educated about history in these countries, and how might that shape how you view the leadership and the future for the country. So I guess the answer everyone gives in their book proposal is it's for the average reader of the New York Times or the Guardian newspaper or the New Statesman who would just like to be able to immerse themselves and go a little bit more into detail into these countries that we hear so much about. They're so often in our headlines, but so few of us will get a chance to travel through and see for ourselves.
Yeah, and in a way, as we talked about earlier, these lessons are universally applicable, aren't they? That all countries can be at risk of using history to serve cynical modern day ends, and we also saw that in George Orwell's novel, of course, 1984, that you quoted in your book. So it's something that keeps coming back again and again. It's not just for North Korea, China, and Russia.
No, I mean, and you see this. You see so many examples of this in so many countries, but it has made me think, much more critically about my own country's history, and it, as I say, being here in America, watching the debate over which part of history to remember. I feel incredibly strongly, having spent so long working on this book, that history should be complicated. It should not be a grand heroic narrative that everybody comes out of looking fairly good and heroic. We should absolutely remember as much of the terrible and the dreadful things that our ancestors and our countries have done, as well as the sort of the more culturally prominent elements that we perhaps choose to and that it's more comfortable perhaps to focus on.
Well, thank you once again, Katie Stallard, for coming on the NK News podcast today. Listeners, you can find her on Twitter at Katie Stallard, and look out for her book, Dancing on Bones, History and Power in China, Russia, and North Korea. And ladies and gentlemen, if you've already have an NK News subscription, do have a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services, specifically catering to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access and a free trial membership at nknews.org today. Also, if you have any feedback, questions, or guest recommendations, please send them to podcast@nknews.org. Our thanks, as always, go to Arius Dare and Brian Betts for facilitating this podcast, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thanks, and listen again next time.